My name is Dave Morrow. 9 months of each year, I live out of my vehicle. I travel the wilderness by foot on an endless backpacking and landscape photography trip. I want to teach and share the photography and outdoor skills that I use on these trips. I don't want to spend hours editing video or sitting in front of a computer, so I made some rules. First, everything's shot on GoPro. This was the best way I found to record quickly on a consistent basis. Second, I can only spend 20 minutes editing each video. So thanks for watching, and welcome to the Landscape Photography Journals. I just got parked out in the middle of nowhere. I drove about 15 miles by dirt road today. A lot of it just being like old mining and four-wheel drive roads that were kind of sketchy. And then I'm driving out basically this overlook point that drops down to this huge canyon. I'm going to backpack down this canyon, and it leads into another even bigger canyon that has a river running through it. So you have like huge tiered canyons coming down like 1,000 to 2,000 feet. And then I drove up on a huge mesa above them, and I'm going to hike down into them. It's like a labyrinth of different canyons. It looks like we might be able to cut straight down through there. Is there a way, for like from where you are, is there a way to get down to the next level? How's it look?
Hold on a second, not sure yet. Promising.
Nice. Wow, what a cool area. It's like a complete slot that goes through. He just went right up through that. So we've been floating for about 4 miles now, and this part of the river is really calm. It's pretty wide, so you can just sit back, listen to all the nice bird chirping, look up at all the cool canyons, and check everything out. But we're headed down the river about 12 miles today. 12 or 14. We're going to find camp in that area, raft another 10 miles in the morning, and then we're going to pack our rafts back up and cut overland down this way. It is a nice day to be out here. So it is getting close to sunset. I'm out shooting and the light's pretty damn nice right now. So I figured I'd take some shots with the video on and do a short walkthrough of my steps and my thought process behind it. So I'm setting up a composition right now. Basically the sky, which is pretty stormy. There's some rain showers and thunder over in that distance. So it's going to kind of crop in this area, this foreground here, and right here as well. Then it has the nice color and reflective light of the river going down there. So what I'm going to do this, since I have a very close foreground right here, which needs to lead the eyes into the scene, as well as a very detailed background, also including a very dark part of the image and a very light part of the image, I'm actually going to take two separate exposures. So the first of these exposures will be taken focused right about that point where the river bends around and disappears. So that will be focusing and exposing just for the highlights of this scene. So I will just expose for the highlights and I will focus in that area. And that'll give me a nice transition line between highlights and shadows, and also focus through that entire depth of field, including everything but this immediate foreground. After I take that exposure, I will take a second exposure, just exposing for these trees and foreground, as well as refocusing there. So the first thing I'm going to do, got my composition all dialed in. Tripod's level, balanced. Now I'm just going to turn on my level to make sure that's good. So there's the composition, and I'll pop it up on the screen. So first thing I'm going to do here, make sure I have a base ISO, or ISO 100 works just fine. I'm going to grab my single point spot focus box right here, and I'm going to move it so it's right about there in the scene. That'll focus me from about here, right where the river bends, all the way to the infinite background. So I'll grab that focus point, zoomed in at 100%, and use back button focus. And that looks good. If I wanted to perfect it, I could watch the back of the screen and dial my focal rate at the same time, just to make sure that that autofocus did the right thing. So that looks good, it's sharp. I'm going to go with F11 here. That'll keep me nice and sharp. Shooting in aperture priority mode. last thing I'm going to do is pull up my RGB histogram here. I'm going to shift it all the way over to the right using exposure compensation right here. So it's touching the very right edge. But since I'm shooting the color red, which blows out very quickly, it's actually going to need to drop down a little bit in exposure, because if I use the exposure that I just dialed in, I'm going to blow out some of these red in the highlights. So that histogram we were looking at is the RGB histogram. It's an average of red, green, and blue. So it can actually be exposed all the way to the right perfectly, pushed all the way over to the white side of the histogram, but you would still blow out red if it's in your scene. So the RGB histogram is a good way to get started, but if you're ever shooting yellow or red, those really light colors, push your exposure all the way to the right, and then just go up here to exposure compensation and back it off darker, about 2/3 of a stop. And you might even need to do a full stop there. Let's see. I think that will work out for those reds right there. I'm watching these really bright reds and yellows on the canyon walls, and I can see that they look good on the back of my screen. Now the histogram is a much better reference than the back of the screen, but I have my histogram and my screen correlating pretty well. I kind of know where they stand, so I think that exposure will be perfect. I don't care about shutter speed here, so I can leave the ISO at 100, and I'll just push the shutter button there. So if that review looks good, I'm going to take this second shot, which is just exposing and focusing for the close foreground. So first thing I'll do here is review this image. Just go back to my focal point, check the focus. Looks good. Check it up in the top as well, but if that focal point's focused, the top's going to be in focus. That looks good. I don't need to check the bottom so much because I'm taking that second exposure there. Click back out and check the histograms. So you can see my RGB histogram isn't quite to the very right. My red histogram is all the way to the right, as you can see right there. So if I wouldn't have stopped down one whole stop darker on the RGB histogram when dialing in the exposure, the red channel would have been blown out. So that's just from me having past knowledge of when red blows out and when yellow blows out and being able to watch for that. But that's something you can always watch for in the future as well when shooting the color red or yellow. The second thing I'm going to do here is refocus right here and also expose for right there. So I'm just going to take my exposure compensation and lighten up this whole image just so I can see down here to refocus. I'll turn my histogram off and I'll just bring my single point spot focus right down on that tree. Zoom in at 100, back button autofocus, and then holding the focal ring and watching the back of the screen, I can ensure it's sharp. I just move it back and forth slightly and ensure the autofocus did the right thing. Zoom back out. I'll shoot f11 for this as well. So now I can pull my histogram back up. And this spike on the right hand side here, I'll darken this down so we can kind of analyze our histogram. Our first exposure looked like this as far as the histogram. So this spike on the right hand side, that little bump, that's denoting the light canyon walls and the bright clouds in the composition. Right here and right here. This huge spike to the left is just saying there's a lot of pixels in the dark midtones, which is denoting all this area down here. So if I look at this spike to the left right here, I know that this tree that I just refocused on is included in that spike. So I'm actually going to move this large spike towards the right or towards the midtones of the histogram. So you can always remember white on the far right, black on the left, and then midtones, which is a mixture of half black and half white, is in the direct center. So I want to put this tree in my final exposure in the midtones. So I'll just use exposure compensation, shift it right, and you can see that big bump moved into the midtones. Now I'm going to be blowing out some of my image up here. I can see that from the histogram and from the sky. But I had already captured that previous exposure when I had focused right there. So I don't really care that that's blown out. I'm just worried about this immediate foreground. So I'll go ahead and take the image, which is just capturing this area. So the hard part when learning all this stuff is knowing when to use techniques like this and when not to use techniques like this. Because if you go through and shoot every single scene like I just did using those techniques, you're really going to overcomplicate your life. So it's all about going out there and constantly practicing and seeing when you need to use this or when you don't. So another key factor in determining when you need to use it or not is knowing how to use your hyperfocal distance and that back button focus technique, which I just talked about. So I will link my other video which completely covers that technique, and it'll help you to see when you need to use this method or when you can just take a single exposure with a single focus point. So I'm just going to zoom in here, and I'm just looking at the bottom of my screen. Now on the Nikon D810 there's a nice feature that your RGB histograms will only show what you're zoomed in on. So I'll first just check my focal point to make sure that I'm in focus. And that looks good. So now I can just move around, make sure everything else in the bottom of that picture looks good. Now these are a little blurry right here. So even though I focused on this tree, the differential from here to there was so far, shooting at this specific focal length, that it did not focus that branch right there. So that's why it's always key on these images to check the very bottom for your focus. So all I have to do here is take another shot, which is kind of annoying, but I'm gonna have to refocus once more right here. And you can do this infinite amount of times. It's all about doing it the least amount of times required to get the image you want. So I just refocus there. I'll just go with f8. I don't need f11 because I'm just focused right there. So I'm happy with how those all turned out. I will look at them on the computer later and see if I can actually make them look good in the final image. It's always really hard to tell when you're looking at the back of a screen compared to when you see this whole thing on the computer, and then you actually know if you like the composition, you actually know if you like the color and light you had while shooting. So I have a long form written article about depth of field and f-stop and how they correlate and how you should select the right f-stop for the specific landscape or scene that you're shooting. And it's about 3,500 words long. It goes into all the science and background, and it will really allow you to visualize what's going on inside your camera, in your head, and then you can make a lot better decisions when you're out shooting. And along with that comes a free PDF, so you can actually download the whole article, take it on your phone, take it out shooting with you, and it'll help you walk through these specific steps that I'm making. So watch the videos that I have, I'll link them below, and download those PDFs so you can take it out in the field with you. But I'm going to get back to shooting this. I think the light's going to get even better as sunset comes around.